This morning we're starting our journey in Putnam County on our way down to Baldwin County. We're here on top of the tower at the Rock Eagle Effigy Mound. This is a prehistoric mound. It's thought to be constructed in between 100 and 300 AD. Wish I had a wider lens. I could get it all in one frame. Rock Eagle is now home to the 4-H Center, which I came to as a kid. If you had a lot of fun in your 20s, you can now come to Dome of the Rock. And this tower that I'm standing on, when I was a kid and I came to 4-H camp, it was said that you counted the steps going up and you counted the steps going down. And if you got the count different on the way up versus on the way down, the ghost touched you. Apparently one of the guys building this tower back in the 30s died while building the tower. A lot of the history has been lost on this effigy mound. Nonetheless, this does still remain, and I'm grateful that it's been protected. There are other effigy mounds in the area, predominantly rock hawk. Nonetheless, on the way to Milledgeville today, I drove right by this and I thought, why wouldn't I stop here? Sometimes when I stand here and reflect on this site, I wonder what it must have been like before European contact and the types of ceremonies and habitation that occurred around this effigy mound. Here we are on the ground next to the effigy mound. This is the tail of the eagle. This way you can kind of get an impression of how tall that mound is. If you are in the area, Rock Hawk is only about 20 minutes from this effigy mound, and it is not as talked about, not as visited, but it is definitely worth a visit as well. I swear we're getting to a cemetery, but we are in Milledgeville, Georgia, here in Baldwin County. It was the capital of Georgia from 1807 to 1868, and this is the old Capitol building here. Oftentimes when you think of the Civil War and the Battle of Atlanta, you think obviously that was the capital, but it was not. It was here in Milledgeville, and this is one of the destinations for General Sherman. He came to the Capitol here, and his men held a mock session in the Capitol building and repealed the order of secession for Georgia. And before you get too gung-ho about Sherman, read up what he did on the Indian Wars after the Civil War. In 1807, the legislature met here before the building had finished being constructed. It is Gothic-style architecture. Unfortunately, I came here on a Sunday, so I won't be able to get in, but we have business to tend to at Memory Hill. Onward. And finally, we're here at Memory Hill Cemetery. Originally, a Methodist church stood here in the early 1800s, around 1809. When Milledgeville was founded and designed, it was designed after Savannah and had like the square system that you see down in Savannah. And originally this was the South Square, and a Methodist church was constructed here and a cemetery was constructed here. And other churches started to build over at the Capitol Square or State Capitol Square. And then eventually that church moved as well, and thus Memory Hill Cemetery was founded. It was originally Milledgeville City Cemetery and eventually changed its name to Memory Hill. I took myself to Covington Library and read a book on this cemetery. So I have a couple more stops beyond the walking tour that we can check out. And the first one is this grave here of Daniel Lyman, or Lehman. He planned to marry a woman in Milledgeville, and he delayed getting here, and the woman married someone else. And it said that he hung himself from the limb of the cedar tree that he's buried under. And looking at the size of this cedar tree, one can only imagine there might be some fact to that. Oh, poor Mr. Daniel Lehman. And a little ways down from Mr. Lehman is this stone here marking the site of the original Methodist church. According to the stone, it was erected about the year 1805. And right next to that stone here is number 35. This is the grave of Benjamin White. Apparently he did not want a gravestone, even though he clearly has one. And his friends planted this oak instead of a headstone. You can see it is a beautiful tree. This here is the grave of Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar. He was a judge here, and apparently he committed an innocent man to be hanged, and when that came to light, or when he discovered that he hung an innocent man, he committed suicide. There are two dogs buried here, the Bonner dogs. Their faithful dog, Nick and Brund. In this book, it talked a little bit about Mr. Bonner, the owner of these dogs, how he would pay debts for people and would refuse a handshake and didn't like to touch people. This is the grave of Benjamin Jordan. He was a wealthy plantation owner in Georgia. What's notable about this monument is who carved it. It was carved by Robert Launitz at the cost of $20,000. Robert Launitz also carved the Pulaski Monument in downtown Savannah, as well as some monuments in Greenwood Cemetery in New York City and Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama, both of which I recommend checking out. Here's the grave of Thomas Petters Carnes. He was a surveyor, and in 1806, he was on the surveying team that marked the 35 degrees of latitude that separated North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. And in that survey, there was an error that occurred, and it wound up that Chattanooga landed in Tennessee. And I am of the opinion that Chattanooga is in Georgia and Tennessee is lying to itself. This is the grave of David Birdie Mitchell. He was a governor of Georgia in the early 1800s, and he is responsible for passing the act that outlawed dueling in the state of Georgia. And right by Mr. Mitchell is thought to be the grave of Julia Force, who in 1893 shot both her sisters in the head. She was then acquitted by reason of insanity and spent the rest of her life in the Georgia Lunatic Asylum. And as the story goes, she befriended the granddaughter of Governor Mitchell, and when she died, she was then buried on their plot. Something really cool that I read about in the book on this cemetery is there are brick monuments here. This monument here is made of brick, or the same material that makes bricks. And while it may seem like a gloomy day here in Georgia, it's my opinion this is perfect cemetery weather. And you will still find beauty here in the winter or the fall or whatever you want to call this season here. Look at all these leaves. I think it's really pretty how it colors the ground. Here lies Mr. John T. Yates. Legend says that he tried to get out of his grave 3 times, and after that 3rd attempt, his grave was covered in a slab. But no slab seems to be present unless it's buried. What I find interesting is right next to him, who I presume to be his wife, has a pile of sticks on her grave, and her grave is covered in a slab. This is the grave of Dixie Annie Jarrett Haygood, otherwise known as Annie Abbott, the Little Georgia Magnet. In the late 1800s, she performed a lot of magical acts, or spiritual acts, or whatever you want to call them, where she was able to lift 5 men with one arm, or resist attempts of being pushed over, different sort of little tricks that took her all around the world, and she performed those. Originally, her grave was unmarked, but as you can see, it is now marked, and there's even a couple stones here left here by visitors. Here's the grave of Willie Ola Tennille. And on her epitaph it reads, her last words were, "Mama, don't you hear the bells ringing?" Here's a fresh grave here. I imagine this must have happened yesterday or the day before. You can still smell the fresh flowers. If you ever wonder why they pile the dirt on the graves like that, as you're filling the grave, you should be tamping the dirt, but that dirt is still gonna settle. And so if you put a little hill on top of the grave, as that dirt settles, that hill will take the place of that settled dirt and will prevent a grave sink. This is the grave of Miss Flannery O'Connor. She was an author in the mid-1900s and died at the age of 39 from lupus. And like most graves of authors that I come across, there's pins and all sorts of other little memorials left on her grave. Here's Mr. John Honest Jack Jones. He was the former treasurer of the state of Georgia, per the headstone. But what I found is that he died after falling out of the 2nd-story window of his home. And even on the stone it says his home stands today at 240 West Washington Street. So if you ever drive by that home, take a look at that 2nd-story window and think about Honest Jack. Here's a beautiful carving on the grave of Mary Little, who died at 20 years old. Note the stump there to represent a life cut short. Here's the grave of Private Edwin Francis Jemison, and he is notable for his photograph that has become popular, and for the longest time his grave was unmarked. And I'm realizing in all my wandering here, I set down my coffee somewhere and I can't find it. Here in Milledgeville is the State Asylum, otherwise known as Central State Hospital. All sorts of spooky ghost videos on YouTube about that place, and it's cool to drive through. But here in Memory Hill Cemetery, there are 3 trenches that were dug for the burial of the patients at that hospital, this being one of them here. And you can see that there are no monuments or headstones, except for this wooden marker here that says Burial Area, State Hospital Patients, 1842 to 1858. In that book, it describes that trenches were dug, and I don't know how they pulled that off. It's not like everyone's dying at once. But nonetheless, this is a mass grave for the patients that were at that hospital in the mid-1800s. This is the grave of William A. Choice. He was an actor in Atlanta in the 1850s. He shot and killed a man in Atlanta, and at the trial, due to his performance, as it is phrased in the history books, he won an acquittal and was confined to the asylum here in Milledgeville. So the book that I read had a list of all the burials and all the epitaphs. And one of the epitaphs that I saw that I really liked was the grave here of Jordan Prosser. And it reads, "He lived in a house by the side of the road and was a friend to man." There's a lot of beautiful ironwork and fencing here, and I read about how this fencing here specifically, these little things here look like figures, and it says when the sun shines through them it looks like eyes. And while I'm not one to drape myself in spooky shit, I read in the book how legend says that on Halloween the eyes glow red. I'm here for the history and the art, not the spooky shit. This is another one of those graves that I read about in the book. And when I read it, I was super excited to come check it out. So according to the book, this is the grave of Dawson Johnson. While it looks like he's buried alone, his 7 wives are buried around him like spokes on a wheel. Under this tree here you have it. A mark of any good cemetery, there's always something in bloom. Also right through here, there's just a beautiful run of some imposing monuments here. These crosses. This man was born on Jekyll Island. All the iron fencing. It's starting to rain a little bit and my notes are getting wet. But look at this. Unacceptable. This is beautiful. Pointing up to the heavens with an anchor symbolizing hope. And the motifs on top. It's an incredible monument here. Right before I left this plot, I checked the map and noticed this was a tour stop. And I found that this is also another monument carved by Robert Launitz of New York. Again, he's the guy that carved that monument in Pulaski Square in Savannah. He's got monuments in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, as well as Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama, both of which are some beautiful cemeteries that I recommend. But again, it's just a very beautiful monument. It's held up well over the years. You must close the gates. Right next to that beautiful monument is this grave here. This is the grave of James D. Allman. I had to brush it off. There was all sorts of acorns on top of it. But he was killed by a gunshot at Andrew Jackson's funeral, and he is the reason that they do not use live ammunition at military funerals. Somewhere in here is the grave of M.L.P. Lungard. He carved many monuments here at Memory Hill Cemetery, and as the story goes, or as legend says, when a couple wed in Milledgeville, they were to go put an order in for a headstone, because he was so slow to carve monuments that by the time they died, it'd be ready. Many of these capstones here are stand-ins for monuments. They're not the original headstone. And as you can see, Emil doesn't even have a headstone himself. This is the Lamar plot here, and there's this single monument that commemorates the different burials on this plot. And one of them is thought to be the earliest recorded burial. About midway in the frame, Louisa Catherine Jane, who died at 1 year and 8 months old, was buried in 1804. What's odd to me is that we're here, and the original site of the Methodist church was way over there through the trees. So, I don't know. I'm finding myself backtracking because I am going to find my coffee, damn it. Shit was like $4 or $5. Bitch. Yes! And then brings us right here to this stop, the Georgia Legislatures. So when Milledgeville was the capital, it was way back in the day, the early 1800s. Maybe you were elected a legislator from your county or your district of Georgia, and you had to come all the way to Milledgeville to handle business. You might not have had a bunch of money, you might have just been popular in your district, and that's why you were elected. And so if you came here for a legislature meeting and you died, you were buried here in Memory Hill Cemetery. The family might not have had money to get you home, or maybe you wanted to be buried here. But all these burials here were legislatures in Georgia. And I found my coffee, damn it. Hell yeah. All the ironwork around this grave here is shaped like a tree. So they've got the tree trunks here, and the fencing has branches, and the gate won't close. I would have closed it. And I think that's really pretty. It was noted in that book that I read. This is the grave of Bill Miner. The inscription reads, "The last of the famous Western bandits, born 1853, died in the Milledgeville State Prison September 2nd, 1814. But he's not actually buried here. He is actually buried right here in an unmarked grave. And this stone has been set here to show where he's actually buried. So while his memorial is right up there, if you just come a short walk over here, you'll find this is where he's buried. This is the Fish Vault here. As the story goes, Mr. Fish was despondent after the death of his wife, and he went inside this vault and sat in his rocking chair and shot himself. And if you knock on the door of the vault and ask Mr. Fish, "What are you doing?" it is said that he says, "Nothing." This vault was excavated in the late 2000s, and inside they found that his wife was buried in a Fisk metallic burial case. Those burial cases were sold in the 1800s, and it's purported that they were airtight and sealed with gas to prevent decomposition of the body. But when they did that excavation, they found that that vault did not work that way, and that the remains were decomposed. When I looked in the cemetery book, apparently Mr. Fish died in 1843, and his wife died in 1845. So while it may be an interesting legend and a cool story, according to the burial records, he died before his wife. Another interesting thing about this vault was that some of the burials were encased in charcoal, which was used to prevent odor or to mask some of the odor of the bodies. Here's something you really don't see that often down here in the South. This is a wooden headstone. I didn't note when they were buried, but oftentimes, due to the humidity here in Georgia, these wood headstones decompose really quickly. So to see something like this is very rare. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, yellow fever was a big thing. There was lots of epidemics. Filled up Bonaventure Cemetery down in Savannah for one. But this is the grave of Dr. Joseph Hill White, and he was one of the lead physicians that started to correlate mosquitoes being the cause to the spread of yellow fever. This here is the McMillan family lot. James McMillan talked about how everyone down here was living on a gold mine of red clay. He owned a famous brick business in the late 1800s. And what's notable about this lot here is the brick rope that surrounds this lot. When I first drove into this cemetery and parked, I noticed this in the distance. And I'm just about done here today, but I wanted to stop by and check this out. Just a really beautifully carved monument. Died in 1884 at 32 years old. With sorrow we bid thee farewell. So I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm ready to go home. And I've come back to what I found to be my favorite little spot in this cemetery, is this little walk right here. My notes are all wet and tattered, but I've really enjoyed making this video. This is actually a cemetery I hadn't been to before, so this was my first time here. It's definitely something I recommend checking out. There's a lot of beautiful monuments in here. It's rich with history. I think we'll wrap this video up coming back to the grave of Mr. Daniel Lyman, or Lehman, from Rhode Island, who hung himself here on this cedar tree. And like the great Mr. Lehman here, let's remember to never be late and always on time.